America did not end with a mushroom cloud. There was no single flash on the horizon, no clean historical moment where a generation could point and say, there, that was when the Republic died. It ended in increments. It ended in press conferences with flags behind them. It ended in lower thirds scrolling beneath polished news anchors who had learned to smile with their eyes dead. It ended in revised definitions, in official language carefully sanded smooth, so the splinters could not be felt until they were already buried under skin. Curfews became nighttime movement restrictions. Military patrols became civil stabilization teams. Raids became domestic security actions. Detention centers became continuity housing. The first camps were not called camps. They were called emergency transition facilities, and the people herded into them were told the word emergency meant temporary, and the word transition meant help was coming. At first, people argued about it the way Americans argued about everything. They shouted across kitchen tables, across comment sections, across split-screen cable panels, across parking lots while gas pumps blinked out of service behind them. One side said the measures were necessary. The other said the line had already been crossed. Then the line moved again and again and again until nobody could remember where it had been before. In cities where riots had burned for weeks, armored vehicles rolled down avenues still scarred black by fire. In suburbs where homeowners had once obsessed over lawn height in school districts, drones hummed over cul-de-sacs and scanned rooftops for heat signatures. In small towns, the old courthouse flags still snapped in the wind, but the sheriffs were gone, replaced by federal task groups with black rifles, black uniforms, and no local names on their badges. The news called it the National Restoration Order. The president's address had come at 9 p.m. Eastern, after 6 straight days of market freezes, rolling blackouts, fuel riots, and a cyber attack that had erased payroll records across half the country. He stood in the emergency operations room under white lights that made his face look waxen and unreal. Behind him sat cabinet officials, military commanders, private sector security executives, and the kind of unelected men who never introduced themselves yet always seemed to be standing near power when history turned ugly. The president did not say martial law. He said restoration. He did not say suspension of rights. He said emergency harmonization of legal authorities. He did not say the federal government was taking control of food, roads, communications, money, and movement. He said the nation would be protected from internal collapse. By dawn, every screen in America was repeating the same phrases. Remain calm. Verify your status. Comply with lawful processing. Recovery requires unity. The flag still flew. That was the first great insult. It flew above checkpoints where exhausted adults stood barefoot on wet pavement with their hands zip-tied behind their backs. It flew over stadiums where locker rooms had been converted into intake bays and concession stands now served ration slurry through plastic tubes. It flew outside hospitals guarded by contractors who decided who counted as urgent and who could bleed quietly in the triage line. It flew above schools where classrooms became dormitories, where gymnasiums became quarantine wards, where old civics posters curled on the walls beside new federal notices warning that speech intended to obstruct restoration efforts could be treated as hostile agitation. The anthem still played too. In the mornings, speakers mounted on utility poles blasted it through empty streets, while patrol drones crawled between apartment towers. People stood in their windows and did not know whether to place their hands over their hearts or duck away from the glass. There have been rumors of cameras mounted in the drones, of facial recognition sweeps, of software that flagged insufficient patriotic conduct. No one knew what was true anymore, which was a point. Fear did not need certainty. Fear worked better when it had room to imagine. The courts still existed on paper. Judges issued rulings from sealed buildings, and their rulings disappeared into agencies that acknowledged receipt and did nothing. Habeas corpus became a phrase spoken mostly by old men, law professors, and detainees who still believed language carried force if it had Latin roots. The Constitution remained available on government websites, though some pages loaded slowly now and carried advisory banners explaining that certain protections were subject to national restoration protocols. The Bill of Rights had not been erased. It had been placed under review. For years, America had been prepared for this without being told preparation was happening. War abroad had hollowed out the soul of the country and brought the machinery home in pieces. First came the surveillance justified by foreign threats. Then came the armored vehicles gifted to local departments. Then came the fusion centers, the predictive policing systems, the domestic extremism watch lists, the private contractors guarding public buildings, the biometric pilot programs. The emergency powers renewed so many times they became background noise. Every crisis left something behind. Nothing was ever fully dismantled. Every temporary measure became permanent infrastructure waiting for the right excuse. The excuses arrived in a flood. A dirty bomb scare in Atlanta that killed no one but justified the first citywide lockdown. A senator shot outside a charity dinner by a man whose manifesto changed twice before the original version vanished. Food distribution warehouses burned in 3 states on the same night. An energy grid failure froze thousands in the northern plains and cooked thousands more in the southern heat. A viral video showed soldiers firing into a crowd. Another video released hours later showed the same crowd attacking first. Experts argued over both until no one knew whether they had seen truth, fabrication, or something worse. Truth edited into a weapon. Assassinations came next. Mayors, judges, agency heads, a governor on live television. Foreign hackers were blamed, then domestic militias, then transnational networks, then distributed anti-state actors, a phrase that meant anyone and everyone. The old America screamed itself hoarse trying to identify the enemy. The new America did not care who the enemy was. It only cared who could be processed. In Washington, the National Restoration Authority was born inside legislation, so large no one had read it before voting. The bill arrived as a rescue package, thick as a brick and wrapped in the language of food credits, infrastructure protection, emergency medical logistics, and cyber defense. Buried inside were the legal organs of a new state, federal movement permits, regional command zones, domestic stabilization tribunals, mandatory identity verification, temporary relocation authority, information hygiene enforcement, civil labor assignments for unclassified persons. The men and women who passed it called it ugly, but necessary. They said history would forgive them. History, being dead, offered no objection. The first biometric scanners appeared at airports and border crossings, then at train stations, then hospitals, then food distribution sites, then banks, then churches that applied for ration partnerships, then apartment buildings whose landlords received federal security grants. The implant program began as voluntary, an efficient way to restore access to accounts, medicine, travel authorization, and food credits after the cyber attacks. The chip was small, they said. Safe, they said. Encrypted, they said. Not tracking, they said. Only verification. Millions accepted it because they were hungry, because their children were hungry, because their parents needed insulin, because their bank account were frozen, because the line was shorter for verified citizens, because no one wanted to be difficult when armed men were watching. Then voluntary became priority. Priority became required. Required became compliance. Compliance became survival. The word citizen changed before anyone admitted it had changed. A citizen had once been a person with rights. Now a citizen was a verified unit inside the recovery system. If the system knew you, you could move. If the system recognized you, you could eat. If the system cleared you, you could work. If the system doubted you, your life narrowed to a line, a fence, a floodlight, and a voice from a speaker telling you to wait for processing. Those who refused the implant were called holdouts at first, then obstructionists, then unverified persons, then unverified citizens, a phrase that sounded almost merciful until people understood what it meant. It meant you belonged to the state, but the state did not belong to you. It meant your obligations remained, but your protections had expired. It meant you could be moved, questioned, assigned, separated, re-educated, detained, or erased while news spoke of administrative burdens and processing backlogs. By the time the stadiums opened, most Americans had already surrendered something. A password, a weapon, a neighbor, a principle, a word they had promised themselves they would never stop using. Some surrendered with tears in their eyes. Some surrendered proudly and called it maturity. Some surrendered while condemning others for not surrendering fast enough. The machinery did not care. It accepted obedience from cowards and patriots with equal appetite. In the central states, where roads ran long between burned-out towns and shuttered factories. The convoys arrived under low-gray skies, buses with blacked-out windows, white federal vans, contractor trucks, fuel tankers, mobile command units with satellite arrays folded like insect legs. The old sports stadium outside the city had once held 40,000 screaming fans, tailgate smoke, cheap beer, marching bands, sunburned faces, halftime fireworks, fathers lifting sons to see over the crowd. Now razor wire looped around its upper decks. Floodlights burned day and night. The parking lots were sectioned by concrete barriers into lanes marked intake, medical, biometric, assignment, correction, disposal. The scoreboard still worked, but it no longer showed home or visitor. It showed instructions. Submit identification. Remove outer garments. Await verification. Non-compliance will be classified. The detainees came in waves. Factory workers with grease still under their nails. Nurses in stained scrubs. Truck drivers. Teachers. Farmers. Mechanics. Accountants. Veterans who stare at the contractors with particular hatred because they recognize posture, spacing, trigger discipline, and cowardice dressed up as command. Men and women who had slept in basements for weeks. Men and women dragged from apartments during grid sweeps. Men and women who had tried to buy food without implants. Men and women whose names had been misspelled by the database and who had discovered that a clerical error could become a cage. They were adults, all of them old enough to remember some version of the country before the loudspeakers. That made the humiliation sharper. No one in line had the softness of innocence left to protect them. They knew what was happening. They knew what words were being avoided. They knew the stadium was not a shelter. Not really. You did not build fences facing inward for a shelter. You did not place machine guns above a shelter. You did not make people kneel in painted parking spaces while drones hovered close enough to stir the hair on their heads. The rain began in the afternoon and turned the parking lot slick and black. Water collected in potholes rainbowed with oil. The detainees stood in switchback lines between metal barricades, shivering under emergency blankets that tore in the wind. Every few minutes a loudspeaker crackled, and a woman's recorded voice told them they were safe.
"You are not prisoners,"
the voice said.
"You are unverified citizens undergoing protective processing. Cooperation accelerates reunification. Resistance endangers community recovery. Please remain calm."
Behind the fences, gray state officers watched without expression. That was not what they called themselves officially. Not yet. Officially, they were Federal Restoration Officers, domestic stabilization personnel, contracted security auxiliaries, continuity enforcement units. But the people had already named them by their color. Gray armor, gray masks, gray vehicles, gray patches where flags should have been. Even the skin around their eyes looked gray after too many hours under stadium lights. They moved like men who had been trained to treat ordinary human hesitation as a tactical problem. They rarely shouted. They did not need to. Their rifles spoke before their mouths did. One of the detainees near the front of line C had no name anyone around him knew. Later, in whispers, people would call him the unverified man, because the system refused to produce anything else. He was broad to the shoulders, middle-aged, with a battered face and the look of someone who had taken a long road through every kind of American ruin. His dark work jacket was soaked through and smeared with mud, oil, and dry blood. A rectangular label had been slapped over his chest after intake, printed in block letters, "Unverified refusal." His hands were swollen from the zip ties. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, but clear. He did not look heroic. He looked like a man who had been beaten, starved, transported, insulted, and stripped of every comforting illusion, and had discovered at the bottom of it all one last piece of himself the state had not yet cataloged. The people around him gave him room, without meaning to. There was something dangerous in a man who had stopped bargaining. Ahead of him, under a canopy lit by portable lamps, officers processed detainees through biometric stations. Each station had a scanner, a restraint chair, a medical tech, a federal clerk, and 2 armed guards. The implant injector looked almost harmless, a white handheld device with a sterile cartridge and a blinking green light. People sat. The clerk read a consent statement. That was not a request. The tech pressed the device into the flesh between thumb and wrist. The machine clicked. The person flinched. The scanner chimed. A new citizen was born. Most went through weeping quietly. Some prayed. Some cursed until a rifle but taught them volume control. One woman vomited into her lap and was processed anyway. One man tried to run and made it 6 steps before a drone struck him in the back with a shock charge that dropped him face first into the wet asphalt. Officers dragged him away by his ankles while the loudspeaker reminded the line that medical assistance was available upon compliance. The unverified man watched all of it. When his turn came, a gray state officer removed the zip tie from his wrist and pointed him toward the chair. The officer was tall and hidden behind a helmet visor, his voice flattened by a speaker grill.
Sit.
The man did not sit. The clerk behind the table glanced up from her tablet. She was young enough to still look frightened by silence. A laminated credential bounced against her chest. Her lips were chapped. Her eyes flicked from the man to the officer and back again.
Sir,
She said, "Try and keep the script alive."
you are currently classified as unverified. Verification is required for restoration access. Refusal may result in escalation of classification. Do you understand?
The man looked past her, past the canopy, past the fence, at the stadium rising against the dead sky. Rain crawled down his face like tears he refused to shed.
Understand?
He said. The officer gestured again.
Sit down.
No.
The word was small. That made it worse. It did not come as a scream, did not give the officers the dignity of pretending they were responding to chaos. It was just a man saying no in a country where no had been administratively removed from the language. The clerk swallowed. Her thumb moved on the tablet.
Sir, failure to comply with biometric verification places you in violation of National Restoration Order directives. You are not being punished. This is a protective measure.
The man finally looked at her.
Who's it protecting?
No one answered. Somewhere behind him, a detainee began sobbing. Somewhere else, an officer barked for silence. The line had stopped moving. Faces turned. The rain ticked against helmets, tarps, concrete, rifles, the plastic shells of drones. The gray state officer stepped closer.
Last instruction. Sit.
The man's hands curled into fists at his sides, not raised, not threatening, simply remembering they were his.
I was born here,
He said.
worked here, paid into it. Bury my mother here, bury my wife here. I don't need a machine under my skin to prove I belong to my own country.
The officer tilted his helmet slightly, listening to something through an earpiece. The drone above the canopy dropped lower. Its camera lens rotated and fixed on the man's face. A red recording light blinked to life. The clerk's tablet chimed. Her face changed when she read the new instruction. It was not much of change, just the blood draining from her cheeks, just the eyes going glossy, just the final private death of whatever part of her had still believed this was paperwork.
Read it.
The officer said.
Aye.
She looked around, as if someone nearby might rescue her from the chain of command. No one did. The officer did not move. The drone watched. The whole line watched. America watched through lenses it did not know were feeding into archives, command centers, training rooms, and eventually rumors.
Read it.
The officer repeated. The clerk lifted the tablet with both hands.
Under authority of the National Restoration Order.
She said, her voice shaking.
Subject designated unverified refusal, having rejected lawful biometric verification and having demonstrated obstruction of emergency recovery protocol, is hereby reclassified as hostile noncompliant.
The man stared at her. His jaw tightened, but he did not beg. The clerk continued. Each word dragged out of her like a tooth.
Sentence is immediate neutralization for the protection of verified citizens and restoration personnel.
The line broke into sound, not movement. They had learned too much from movement, but sound escaped them. Gasps, prayers, a woman saying no, no, no under her breath. A man cursing God and government in the same sentence. Boots shifted, rifles rose, loudspeakers crackled, trying to drown the human noise with recorded calm. The unverified man looked back over his shoulder at the crowd. Not at anyone in particular. At all of them. His face was bruised, wet, filthy, and strangely peaceful in that final second. Not because he was unafraid, but because fear had failed to purchase him.
Remember this,
He said. The officer shot him in the chest. The sound cracked across the parking lot and slapped back from the stadium walls. The man staggered, but did not fall at once. For one impossible heartbeat, he remained standing, mouth open, eyes wide, as if even his body refused order. Then a second shot struck him and folded him backward onto the wet asphalt. Blood spread beneath him. Dark at first, then diluted by rain into thin red rivers that ran along the painted lane lines toward a drain clogged with leaves and trash. The crowd screamed. The officers surged forward.
Remain calm.
The loudspeakers said,
You are not prisoners. You are unverified citizens undergoing protective processing.
People dropped to their knees because rifles told them to. Some covered their faces. Some stared because they could not look away. A few began to chant without planning it. Not words, just a low animal sound of grief and terror. The drone hovered over the body, recording. The clerk stood frozen behind the table with the tablet still raised. Sentence complete. Soul not yet informed of what her hands had helped do. The gray state officer holstered his sidearm and turned to the line.
Next.
Nobody moved. He raised his rifle.
Next.
An old veteran stepped forward, shaking so badly his boots splashed in the rainwater. The medical tech wiped the implant device with a sterile pad. The clerk lowered the tablet and did not look at the body. The scanner blinked. The machine clicked. The line resumed. That was the moment the country understood. Not because of the killing alone. America had seen killing. America had exported killing, televised killing, debated killing, justified killing, mourned killing, ignored killing. What changed was the setting, the sentence, the procedure, the way death had become an administrative consequence, read from a tablet under a federal canopy, while a drone documented compliance metrics. The way the state did not rage, did not panic, did not hide. It murdered a man in public and then called for the next person in line. By evening, the footage had spread despite the filters. Someone inside the stadium leaked it. Then the leak was scrubbed. Then copies appeared. Then the copies were labeled foreign disinformation. Then an official statement confirmed an unfortunate but lawful neutralization event involving a hostile non-compliant individual at a regional restoration site. The anchors looked grave. The commentators argued whether the officer had followed protocol. The administration promised a review. The review praised restraint. Across the country, people whispered the same name. They whispered it in apartment basements while drones passed overhead. They whispered it in church kitchens where volunteers hid unverified adults behind stacks of donated canned goods. They whispered it in truck stops, in ruined suburbs, in the backs of ambulances, in prison buses, in half-empty offices where clerks processed lists of names and pretended not to understand what the red marks meant. They whispered it in barracks. They whispered it in camps. They whispered it beside bodies. The gray state. Not a coup, exactly. Not a dictatorship in the old theatrical sense. With one madman screaming from a balcony and banners changing overnight. It was colder than that. It was the color of bureaucracy after the blood had been washed from its hands. It was the color of concrete walls, ash skies, blank uniforms, dead screens, and faces trained not to react. It was a color left behind when red, white, and blue no longer meant anything but decoration above a checkpoint. Somewhere far from the stadium, in a room full of dim monitors and stolen signals, a man named Elias would later watch the leaked execution again and again until the image burned itself behind his eyes. He would pause on the unverified man's face. He would study the officer, the drone, the fence, the compliance signs, the crowd forced to kneel in the rain. He would understand that propaganda had finally become weaker than truth, because truth had grown monstrous enough to frighten even those who had denied it. But that would come later. For now, there was only the stadium, the rain, the line, the body cooling on the asphalt, while verified citizenship clicked into wrists one by one. And above it all, the loudspeaker kept speaking in a woman's calm, recorded voice, promising safety to a nation that had just watched itself die.